talk on what does open research mean. My name is Peter Mooney, so I'm uh, normally located in the oldest building in Maynooth University, just across the road from the library. And I suppose to give an introduction to myself, I'm going to give a small introduction to the talk in a way, in that I'm giving this talk as both a practitioner of research. So I do my own research. I supervise students doing research. I work with researchers. I apply for research funding. I am involved with the reviewing of applications for funding. And then on the other side, then I write papers. I help students write papers. I collaborate with others to write papers. And I'm also involved in journal editing and journal reviewing. Now, the reason, just to give you that broad overview, is to show you that open research actually means quite a large domain. So it's not easy to define it very easily. And what I'm hoping to do today is to give a guide to the idea of open research, primarily to early career researchers. So those researchers who are maybe new to the research domain in general. And while there is a slight bias, non-intentional, towards science here, many of the ideas and concepts and that I'm trying to talk about today are applicable to all type of research scholarship, and not just something like computer science or physics or biology. And there's many definitions of open research in practical terms, and you can find these everywhere on the internet. Open research is something that embodies this idea of best practice. So rather than there being a set of rules, there's a best practice guide in opening access to results, to data, to the protocols used to actually carry out the research, and other aspects of the research process. Now, it, it may or may not include the use of open data, the use of open source software, for example. So it doesn't necessarily always have to include those, but more often than not, it will include those aspects. And really, what open research means to me is this concept of applying an open philosophy and an open policy to the whole research cycle. And you will find that if you Google for open research, you will probably find open scholarship, open science, those type of interchangeable terms actually mixed in the brew of what is available. For for people who are familiar, or even who are unfamiliar with research, many people try to visualize what researchers do uh, in some type of a flow pattern, or a cyclical pattern. And again, if you do a search for what is the research cycle, you will get thousands of results returned, all of which are very similar diagrams to what I have just chosen on the slide in front of me. I particularly like the one on the left-hand side. So it's my left-hand side, research cycle, where you can imagine jumping into this at any stage, but let's just take the 12 o'clock approximately here as the first step, where when you're beginning a research project, you think and plan. The next stage is probably the research. It's where you're discovering the ideas, you're looking at the solutions. Maybe the next step is to gather data, gather information, perform the analysis. And then one of the key parts in any research cycle is the research writing and publication. And I suppose the catch-all word for this is dissemination. So it may be a paper, it may be a blog post, it might even be a video explanation, it may be a talk like this. And that then is the creator of this idea of impact, where the researcher works through this cycle, writes and publishes. that information and knowledge is disseminated and shared, and it creates impact. The impact might be for other researchers, it could be for the general public, it might be for policymakers. And then this in turn then can spark new ideas, new questions that begin the cycle again. And we can see with a very similar diagram here that the main steps in this cycle are all of the same. Identify a problem, develop a plan, collect data, and again, or information, depending on whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And then we see this idea of the analysis, dissemination, and impact. Now, for those not involved in research all of their lives, and what I find sadly nowadays is when I talk about the old days, that's when I was involved as a young researcher or an early career researcher. And rather than pick on any specific scientific problem or domain, I'm going to look at if scientific research involved the making of a Black Forest gateau. So one of the nicest cakes out there, if I may be a little bit biased. And if I break this into three parts, into three segments in time, so I call the old days, so maybe 20 years ago, that the output of scientific research into the Black Forest gateau was simply the cake was presented and shared as an output. That's all. We don't know what happened in the background. We're not really sure what processes went on to develop this output. But we know the scientific process, the research cycle happened, and we have a beautiful output at the end. Now, I suppose in the last 10 to 15 years, then, there began a move towards the idea of open science and open access in publication. And what that meant in the Black Forest gateau research community was that researchers would then begin to, for example, share their ingredients. So here's my list of ingredients. Now, I'm not going to give you away the secret information on how I gathered these ingredients together and formed them into a nice Black Forest gateau. I'll probably publish that in a paper, but the paper is going to be in a journal that most members of the public and maybe even people in education in Pacific countries or regions will not be able to access. But we still can see that there is a delicious output to this research. However, today, where we see open research, we see this idea of reproducible and replicable research in science. This has all changed. And we'll talk about each of those terms in a few minutes. Now you can, in proper open science, open research, you will find the ingredients, you will find the methods, you may even find video explainers, podcasts, blog posts, etc. And then a very novel thing for researchers is this idea of this interaction and collaboration. So here, I know the screenshot is difficult to read, but this is people who are commenting on what if they did a different set of steps or tried the ingredients together in a different way. But what we have here now is we have everything that we need for us to try and reproduce and replicate the science that we see in front of us. And a more serious tone, as we're all well aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has utterly changed the world in so many ways. But in another way, it has utterly changed how the world is actually doing science together. It has been 2020 has been an extraordinary year for science, not least for the fact that we are all working in our scientific offices, which is our living rooms or bedrooms or kitchens now, with our pets and our children and all, and our family members around us. But what it's done is triggered unprecedented collaboration in research. And I've had colleagues who work in biology and the microbiology and those type of, and they said they could never have envisioned the collaboration that has happened in the last 12 months, which may seem like a decade to us, what we've been through, but a year in research is very, very short. One of the most visited websites, and Maynooth University's Aero has input into this, the COVID-19 data hub. Who would have thought 12 or 14 months ago that we would be at all interested in the incidence rate of a particular infectious disease or a virus? We'd no idea. And why would the government make such a portal available? And what this is doing is offering the general public accessible research outputs to show how incidence rates are calculated, to show what the incidence rate in your county or your region is, what the 14-day average, what the 5-day average is. And you can download that data and verify it for yourself. But in reality, we've talked a little bit now at the moment about the idea of opening up research, of open science. In reality, most research happens, and if we don't discount the, I suppose, the physical situation we find ourselves in, where we are all mostly working from home, that most research actually happens very far from the public view. It happens in laboratories. It happens, late in the evening on calls with colleagues in other countries. It happens in front of computer screens in dark rooms, reading papers, sitting down with the cat, sleeping on your notes. This is how research actually really happens, very far from the public view. However, one of the big changes for me that I've been lucky enough to witness, particularly over the last 5 to 10 years, is the emergence of collaborative tools and technologies, along with this idea of open data and open access, that has brought research into the open. So there's 4 highlights here on the slide: collaborative tools, open access, open data, and new publishing models. And I will be dealing with all of these in the remainder of the presentation. Collaboration is now easier than ever for researchers to undertake. So now having a research team split over not just countries, but continents is absolutely normal. Geographic distance disappears to zero when you have these collaborative tools. Open access brings down the barriers of opening of the access to outputs from research. So previously, in my rather non-serious example of the Black Forest Gatto, now you can access the journal paper that outlines the recipes required and the methodology required for you to understand the research cycle that was undertaken to generate a particular output. Open data, of course, has transformed things in many ways. In my old days, during my PhD, we had to use open data from the United States on road networks and traffic networks because we couldn't get any of this data in Europe that was not exorbitantly priced and way outside of our budgets. Today, that's absolutely normal that we will go and access data from Ireland under open data availability. And new publishing models. No longer is the journal paper, which is hidden away somewhere where the general public and many people do not know where to find it, is not the only publishing model now available. We see things like preprint servers, software code repositories, blogs, social media, and we're going to talk about those all in the next couple of minutes. I've taken this slide from a paper that's just recently been published, and it very keenly outlines that research cycle through, as we said, one of the most amazing years in science that we've just had, to the development of not just one vaccine, but several vaccines. And what we see here is that initially, I suppose at the beginning of 2020, there was a lot of research activity, but crucially, the research activity was immediately open sourced, meaning that researchers were sharing their methodologies, their approaches, their ideas with each other immediately, not 2 years later, in real time. When studies and experimentation and analysis and lab work began, the raw data was made available as open data. Again, the speed at which this happened is what is incredible. From the raw data, the analysis, the experimentation, the inquiry was performed, and we got publications that again were open access through preprint servers and other means. And then finally, we have where we are now at the beginning of the rollout of a global vaccination program. And this is not just a screenshot from 10 years. This is a screenshot from about 12 months of work. The preprint servers, as I mentioned, are essentially places where you can access versions of journal papers before or after they have been published. The idea is that the preprint allows for open access. It's not necessarily peer reviewed. So other experts have not necessarily read the paper and agreed on the content. It can allow comment and review. It's very fast because the moment you submit something to a preprint server, it's available. And that makes it much more faster compared to traditional journal outlets. The key thing is that there isn't a peer review in the same way that normal journal outlets, but this accelerates the distribution of research, particularly when it's required in a fast and real-time way. And there's been many talks this week. There's True Love Data Week, which has shown and hammered home the benefits of open access. And think about those preprint servers. They increase visibility because it gets your paper, your publication out there quickly. It drives innovation. Other people will see this quickly. It has a global impact. Everyone can see it. It's public access. You're likely to have increased citation rates because your paper is out there faster and more accessible, and it usually complies with the policies of funding agencies. Incredibly, for COVID-19, global literature on the coronavirus disease is actually pretty much available, open access for every paper. And this is absolutely incredible. And I like to tell people about this that are not even interested in publications and open access. I just put the arrow here. This screenshot is probably about a week old, but this number is probably increased. We have 147,000 publications from all over the world, which are open access, many of them preprint, but in the most clearly available demonstration of open scientific output that I have ever seen in my scientific career. You will notice that people like Science Direct and Elsevier and others have made papers that are related to science and policy and other scholarship related to COVID-19 are all available using open access. So the general public, those interested in reading more about what is happening in terms of research, can access these very, very easily. And I myself took advantage of this last year to publish a paper in a journal that certainly is outside my field. Human geography is not my field of expertise, but there was an opportunity to publish an open access paper on my area, which is looking at how web maps are used, particularly early on in the pandemic response, and how web maps could be used incorrectly to convey information about the spread of the virus and our response. I write is feasible up there at the top because it's a debate for another day, but sometimes your research may contain information and data that may not be immediately ready for open access. There can be privacy and ethical and legal issues. So open access is the preferred model when it is feasible for you and your research team to do so. But My next slide is my own interpretation of the idea of open access and how we get there. And this is how I see open access in terms of data and in terms of more so, I suppose, in terms of journal articles, which are the currency of research and academia. So at the top, we have a beautiful, bountiful land of open access. And how do we get there? Well, there are a couple of routes, and I'm going to start here on the left. The preprint servers are a nice way to get there. It's just you will be on the road to open access immediately. You may not see the fruits of your labor straight away. You actually might, depending on your content. The great thing is that there's no charge. There's no article processing charge to go via the print servers and reach the land of open access. The classic peer review process for most good journal outlets. So what happens here is that a paper is submitted by a researcher or a research team. It gets reviewed by experts. The editor then makes a decision based on those reviews, and your journal paper gets published. In some cases, like my example from the previous slide, there may be open access available by default, or your research group may have the option to pay a charge to have your paper written and available as open access. The reason for the sharks here is to get through the peer review process is often quite a difficult challenge, because the peer review process can be emotionally challenging for even the most hardened and experienced of researchers. However, on the right, the path to open access that sprung up recently in the last 5 years, I suppose, certainly in a greater extent, is predatory journals. And these are a set of journals that have a very quick or absolutely no peer review. And they will provide open access directly for a fee, so an APC. So essentially, they are an oasis lying in front of you with absolutely no real problems, no shark infested waters. Now, they do provide open access, but their model of publishing is quite different to the preprint server and the classic peer review. Again, it's a slide that could have a whole separate presentation on it for another day. But that's, I think, a summary of what a researcher would look at when they have a paper which they are ready to publish. Of course, publishing papers today is not the only thing that researchers want to do and are required to do. Very often, researchers and scientists are required to share the software code that they wrote, the data, the ideas. Maybe they have design diagrams, they have experimental setups, maybe even the knowledge that they generated. And one of the greatest repositories of these on the internet today is GitHub. And GitHub is a place where you can share code, data, you can share tutorials, you can share knowledge. And it is becoming almost a de facto standard for people to do so. Again, it's a separate talk to introduce you to GitHub and how great it is and what you need to do to work with it. Two examples. The most popular project on GitHub is called Free Code Camp. And that is exactly as it says in the name. It's where you can learn to code or program. And it's got hundreds of resources to learn to code for free. You can download all of that yourself if you want to learn Java or you want to learn Python or something like that. And then you can interact with people. The one at the bottom is TensorFlow. I know most people may not have heard of this. This is Google's machine learning framework. And you can be pretty certain that a lot of the intelligent stuff that is going on in your Google search and your Gmail and things like that is built upon TensorFlow and similar frameworks. But incredibly, this is open source and you can download this and use it yourself. You can even change it yourself, as 84,000 people have done here through the fork mechanism. I think there was a talk earlier in the week with FAIR data principles. That's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And what we've looked at the moment is findable and accessible. Interoperable is the GitHub approach. Reusable, of course, is open access and open data. One of the things I want to draw your attention to is the findable and this idea of persistent identifiers. Now, you may not understand what they are, but for example, www.maynoothuniversity.ie is an identifier for the website of Maynooth University. But what we would like to be able to know is that in 100 years' time, will that still be the website of the university? Now, it probably will, but there are millions and billions of websites now. How about if we can provide identifiers directly to documents, such as papers? And that would mean that those papers would be always identified by a particular number or identifier. And what you might see here in these screenshots with the red arrows is a complicated URL or web link. And this is the DOI, the Document Object Identifier. Now, this is like a barcode for academic papers, research outputs. And we don't need to worry about how this breaks down. The key thing is that this URL here, or this DOI, will never change. It's unique. It's a bit like a unique number, your ID number, that will never change. So every time that is referred to, we can link straight back to that paper or that resource. That might be data, that might be code, for example. And I think this is one of the most powerful aspects of the FAIR data principles, is promoting the use of the DOI. Just to finish up with reproducible research and replicable research, what we've talked about at the moment is the actual outputs. We've only been talking about what happens at the end of the process. But what happens if someone wants to try to see if your process actually works independently of you being involved? And reproducible research is something that's very, very prominent nowadays. And research is considered reproducible when the exact results can be reproduced, provided another research team or researcher is given access to all of the original data, software, methodology, the steps, etc. Now, when I say exact results, in most cases, we're meaning that if the output of the research is the number 7, if you run the research in a reproducible way and get 6 or 8 as your answer, something has gone wrong. But it may be a case that in some cases that there may be some level of tolerance, so a result between 6 and 8 inclusive is allowed. Now, when they say raw data, that actually means all of the data. So if you went out and done a survey, it would have to mean all of the survey in its primary form and a complete set of instructions used. The idea here is that another scientist or another researcher of equivalent skill would be able to reproduce, not simply the person on the street, because there is a lot of skill involved here that is developed over years of research training. But to give an idea of what reproducible means, I'm going back to the Gatto example. And let's suppose we have a research team, the Hairy Bikers, a well-known culinary research team. And what they have done is they have completely made their research into making a Black Forest Gatto completely open. They've given you the exact ingredients, the exact method they've used. They've even shown you a video of how to put this together. So the two gentlemen have decided to go with open access. And that looks reproducible to me. I'm not sure whether I would be able to reproduce this, but then we have the concept of replicable, whether an independent team can use the same process and steps and actually arrive at the same results as the original study. So here is a slightly different turn on this, that if you can get the process and the steps together, that you will end up with the same output. It must be an independent group, and you can use different methods, but they must be valid research or scientific methods. So this is the idea of something completely independent, a team independent of your own verifying. So let's go back to the Gatto again. And again, as I said earlier, we can't just bring people who are not skilled in the area. So we've employed Mary Berry to see if the hairy bikers approach is replicable. And Mary has supplied her own list of ingredients, but is using the hairy bikers method. And given that she is quite a skilled baker, as we know, she has managed to use the method to come up and reproduce and replicate that study. So I think that's a better idea to exemplify this rather than maybe picking out specific scientific examples, the idea of reproducible and replicability. I'm just going to skip the next two slides. There are some issues around reproducibility and replicability. Again, as I said, we could have an hour's talk about these two issues alone. It can be sometimes difficult to give an independent team access to your raw data. There could be legal issues around that. There could be ethical issues, maybe even privacy. So for example, if we do a survey of people's maybe web surfing habits during the last 12 months, we may not be able to allow someone access to the raw data, the primary data. However, in some cases where other types of research has been conducted, open data can really help here because it's already available in its raw form usually and can be used. Sometimes the method could be commercially sensitive, and even using the same equipment as another lab might be difficult. So you might not have the same, lab equipment as the team that generated this method. Sometimes the software might be difficult to set up on another machine, or there can be some technological issues. And then replicable data. If you're trying to replicate the study, it may be difficult for you to collect a very similar data set to what the original raw data was. So for example, if the original raw data set was air quality measurements in Maynooth for 12 months, it would be impossible to collect exactly that same data set for Maynooth 12 months later. So it would be a similar data set rather than being exactly the same. So almost finished now, and a wrap up, I think, looking at what we have spoken about. What should an early career researcher look for in open research? So there's been a lot of talk about the output there. There's been a lot of talk about the method, the reproducibility, the replicability of your research. But for someone embarking on their career, they should focus on creating their own niche and their own research focus. Build your profile first. Always look towards open data, even if this means just getting your work started. If you needed a data set to try out, if you cannot find data somewhere else, open data might have the answer there. I strongly encourage the use of open source software. This might require you to do some extra learning, but it will never be wasted time or wasted effort. Be prepared to publish in many ways: the preprints, the traditional way, blogs, through video, through podcasts, through online seminars. Always seek the advice of your mentors for some guidance here. And always try to implement good data management practices. And good data management practices can sometimes mean something simple like backing up your data, giving files the correct name, using a database rather than a spreadsheet, for example. And don't be afraid to make mistakes or ask for help. The more research becomes open, the more help there is available. And of course, open research is part of a bigger tree. So it's a leaf on the tree of open education, where the entire process from the moment someone begins learning as a child up to becoming a professional scientist or professional researcher, they could experience access, opportunity, and equity through open education. So more learning content is available. Education is available in a more open way through open courses, through open books, open libraries, for example. So to finish off, the issues I suppose that will take some time to resolve, despite how far we've come, is reproducibility and replicability are unique to every study or research project. So there's not a one size fits all. The charges for open access in some journals are still very high, and this provides a barrier to a lot of people who are trying to publish as open access, and this has to be addressed. Where to publish as open access is not an easy choice, and there isn't an easy answer. And finally, there's a really deep, complex relationship between ethical behavior, legally correct behavior, and privacy for many data sets and databases. Open data sets, by their very nature, because they are open, have resolved a lot of those issues. And that's why I suggest that that's one of the first places that you look. So to finish off, my final slide, with open research, we can all actually help make the cake and eat it. We all can enjoy the output from open research. Open access allows us to see and learn how others made their cake. Reproducible and replicable allows us to copy and reuse the successful people's approaches, the Hairy Bikers and Mary Berry, for example. Open data, as I've said before, we can try different recipes and see how they turned out. We can ask the public by sharing this with them. How does the cake taste? Citizen science actually allows the citizens to help researchers and scientists make the cake. And then policymakers and the public, which we are all members of, then all have the best possible tasting cake because this has been done in an open way. So thank you very much for watching and listening. I'm sure we're all hungry for some cake, even if it's not Black Forest Gatto at the moment. My slides are available via email from myself, plus any questions that you'd like to ask me that you'd prefer not to ask in the Zoom environment. And thanks to Elaine and Fiona, the recording of this talk will be available on the Maynooth YouTube library, YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Peter. I think we all have a great need to go and have some cake now after today. So I'm just checking the chat, Peter, for any questions. There's a lot of comments in there, really appreciating the Gatto analogy in helping to explain the various aspects of open research. I'm just checking to see, is there an actual question? And perhaps if people have any questions they'd like to ask Peter, perhaps you can unmute and ask them as well. Don't see one. Oh, I do see one actually, a question here from Peter. Are Google's competitors able to reverse engineer TensorFlow since it is open data?
That's a great question. And as a computer scientist, I could very easily bore you on the answer. The answer is yes. So because this code is open source, all of the code is there for TensorFlow and equivalent type libraries. Now, the key is that Google, Facebook, Twitter all make software available. But remember, what they use the software for inside their organizations is certainly not open source. But the software itself is open source, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit like this analogy that Google have made their toolbox available, but what they do with their tools happens behind closed doors within the Google environment. So you can't really see what application or how the tools are applied to a particular data set or a particular stream of data or particular users. Because you now have the toolbox, you at least have the same set of tools that you can apply to your to your data, to your situation. And because it's something like Google there that have made this open access and open source, it's generally going to be very, very good software. It's going to have a lot of interaction, as you see there on the screenshot. And it's likely to be used in a lot of research in general. So I hope that kind of answers the question. Uh, they're giving you the toolbox, but not necessarily showing you how they use that toolbox inside of their organization.
I see. Peter's just asking to confirm. So it's just the software foundation that is made open data.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Okay. I have another question here from Anita, who's asking, what are your thoughts on the quality of open data and how can we make sure that the data we analyze is eligible for academic research?
Okay, that's a great question. And there's I'm going to split the answer in two. We generally have open data from two sources. We normally have them from scientific or authoritative sources, such as policy. So, for example, the previous talk in this series from the department showed the government's initiative here in providing open data. So there's an initiative, and there's a real requirement that the government release open data that is of very high quality, that has been checked and double checked, so that when others are using it, that for 99% of the time it's going to be correct. We're all human. There may be an error or something there, but the best efforts are placed in to make sure that that data is of the highest quality. Other types of open data and open source software and open data may not go through that specific pipeline of checks and balances. And that then leaves you in a situation where the checks about data quality and suitability are down to your specific application or your specific problem. So in your own area, let's just think if we're using if we're using some open data collected from an alternative source, then maybe a scientific source for traffic analysis in Maynooth, you may have to run some checks and balances yourself to try and get a handle on whether that data is suitable for your needs. Another way to ascertain that is that with those FAIR principles I talked about a few minutes ago, there should be supporting metadata and documentation with the data and with the software, which might outline any problems or anomalies or issues in the data that you should be aware of. The overall reply to that is that all data, regardless of its source, is always need to be checked for whether it's suitable for the problem that you're trying to solve, and it's fit for that purpose. So is it fit for the problem that you're trying to solve, and is it suitable? And very often you have to answer some of those questions yourself, and then it may be a little bit after, when you start doing your analysis or your development or otherwise, that you begin to see that this data set is not working for me for a particular reason, and I may have to look at something else. So it's a complicated answer, I know, but with there being kind of two specific ways of getting open data, there isn't a one size fits all answer. But it's like anything, even with open data from authoritative sources, the same checks and balances should be done by a researcher, just as due diligence, as part of their own research work.
Right. Hopefully that's okay for you, Anita. And I have another question here from Breda. Do you have any comments or thoughts on publishing models and how that is going to develop, and can the open movement steer that?
Yes, I think the open movement can steer that. I think people like myself and colleagues and the next generation of researchers and scientists and academics also have a huge role to play in pushing an open access publishing model forward. So, for example, in my own research and my own research group and my teaching and my supervision, I very much drive an open data and an open access agenda. And it's an agenda with good reason. It's well founded, as we see from the talk today. There is obviously going to be pushback from the publishing industry, which stand to lose a lot of revenue, obviously, if with certain models of open access. But what we're seeing a lot in funding, for example, is that now when research funding is allocated to universities and colleges and institutes of technology, there is a sizable part of that budget which is set aside for open access publication. And that may include open access to open source software. So there's already that incentive for the researchers to continue publishing in an open way, using open data, accessing open resources, sharing and disseminating in an open way. So I think not just the open movement on its own, I think academics, regardless of what department or what discipline you are part of, we all have a part to play in this. And the role, the model that we pass to our students and those that we mentor means that the next generation, which is only ever going to be 5 years behind us, moving through, will be this, this rising tide that's lifting all of the boats that are there. So I'm very, very positive and very hopeful for the next 5 to 10 years. And what we've seen in the last year in terms of the use of preprint servers for this rapid dissemination can only be a positive driver in this way forward.
Thanks, Peter. I hope that answered your question, Breda. I don't see any further questions in the chat, so I'll just ask if anybody listening in has any last questions, and just to unmute if you do. I'm not seeing any. So maybe then in that case, I'll just say thanks very much, Peter, for such an excellent talk. It was really interesting, plus bonus recipes, which we'll all try out now and try and reproduce the research. And thanks to everybody who attended as well. It's great to see you all here.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you everyone for attending. My pleasure.